Hello and welcome back to VarnVlog Solo, where we're talking about breaks, dirty and clean. I talked about the possibility of a clean break with the DSA and why I would support it, why I think the Popular Front method would still even require the DSA to be more independent than it can be right now. And I'm not even generally a Popular Frontist. I went over the problems with the SPA, although I will review that they had a clean break strategy, deliberately eschewing the path of liquidation that had been pursued by the People's Party prior to them in the apolitical nature of things like the Knights of Labor. But when they threw themselves into coalitions and strong endorsements of an inside-outside strategy with the New Deal, they eventually liquidated themselves, and then to the point that they started even taking on anti-communist rhetoric, and then by the 1960s were so irrelevant that Max Shachtman had no problem liquidating them. Then I talked about the CPUSA, and I talked about their numbers, which, while were never as high as the SPAs, they got close. They never had anything like the share of the vote. The CPUSA never got more than 2% of the vote, with William C. Foster, R. Browder, or Gus Hill as their candidates. And for large periods of time, they just endorsed, well, they just supported people supporting the Democratic Party candidate while not formally endorsing anyone, and arguing against like Bernie Sanders being an ultra leftist and whatnot. I remember those days in the 2010s. But I do want to remind people the CPUSA, while it did not have the voter leverage that the SPA had, they had enormous structural leverage in the 1940s. They had inroads into government. They were the primary leadership under John Lewis of the CIO. They were the largest supporter of Black cultural apparatuses, period, and one of the militantly anti-racist forces in the South. And they did have tens of thousands of disciplined cadres at one point. They allowed the Democratic Party, though, to take credit for their material wins, particularly in light of the New Deal coalition. Actually, in that sense, not that different from the SPA. And then they were thrown under the bus during the Red Scares, with the Democrats not doing anything to protect their former allies at all. When a radical organization like the SPA or the CPA presents itself as an uncritical left-wing insurance policy for the bourgeois party against the right, the bourgeois party reaps the benefits, but also the socialist organization can be used as a scapegoat for the system's failures, and also can be purged by empowering their enemies who have more strategic leverage after the need for the coalition is done. This brings me to some non-American examples that relate to the dirty and clean break, but this one has more to do with professional managerial bureaucracy and labor aristocracy. So we're going to look at the history of the early German SPD, particularly in the 1910s and 20s. The SPD is often praised for doing what a clean break requires, but without the break. They built a massive parallel society with socialist bicycle clubs, singing societies, consumer cooperatives, massive trade unions. By 1912, they were the largest party in the Reichstag. And they were also not mass voter parties, they were mass member parties, which I talked about the difference in kinds of parties. There are parliamentary parties like the factions that emerged In the British government, there were mass voter parties like the Democrat Republican Party, and then later the Democrats and the Republicans in the United States. And then there were parliamentary mass support parties, which had a whole stratum of civil society attached to it, that the mass voter parties didn't, and the primary model for that was the SPD. And that model was spread throughout the Second International. The SPD grew into a massive electoral machine. It generated a brand new social stratum, though. Thousands of full-time party bureaucrats, journalists, lawyers, and union officials. This stratum, which in some ways are the historical ancestors of the professional managerial stratum and NGO-ification, gradually prioritized the preservation of the party infrastructure and its legal status over an actual socialist program and their actual principled obstructionism that had made them so popular early on. Now, it's hard to say if this was part of why they got blindsided by fascism and couldn't figure out how to operate in regards to the communists. But it's important to remember the hostility was mutual between the two groupings by that point. Because the party's leadership was composed of professionals who feared the state would confiscate their printing presses and outlaw their institutions, they chose stability over principle more often than not by the middle of the 19 teens. When August 1914 arrived, this professional bureaucracy voted for war credits, which effectively destroyed the International, the Second International, although there was another Second International to emerge in its wake later, to protect their institutional real estate and their positions with the Ebert government. Kautsky and Bernstein, both the revisionists and the orthodox, actually did oppose the war, but they felt like they could not vote against the majority of the party and thus sat on their hands and only left to form the independent SPD, the USPD, when the war got to its height. And they were very wishy-washy even about that. The lesson for today is clear. An infrastructure dominated by professionals will always choose institutional self-preservation over international class struggle. And they may even have a domestic class base within the working class for doing so at first. Now, let's talk about an electoral vanguard without a mass base, which is the French Socialist Party. The French left, in my mind, is a stark warning about what happens when you win elections in the bourgeois space without an organic working class discipline. And this is really seen in the Mitterrand term. And the communists, who were already reeling from the effects of the Sino-Soviet split and their inability to deal with the student movement after May 68, were really unable to figure out what to do with the Francois Mitterrand election. Now, you can go back and read Jean Baudrillard's The Divine Left for why he kind of became a post-Marxist in light of what he saw the communists not doing after the Mitterrand government was established and leading up to it. Francois Mitterrand was elected on a radically socialist platform called the Common Program, promising massive nationalizations, wealth taxes, and a break with capitalism. But within 2 years, international capital strikes, capital flights from France, and currency devaluation forced a choice. Because the French Socialist Party had become an electoral vehicle dominated by technocrats, teachers, and civil servants, not necessarily people totally outside of the working class, but not definitely part of the blue-collar strata of it, and had no real organized militant class capable of seizing factories and defending the economy, the Mitterrand government executed a austerity turn in 1983. The Communist Party in France also, because of their soft allegiance with the PS itself, that's the Socialist Party, did not know what to do. The PS spent the next 30 years basically until the coming of Sarkozy, managing French neoliberalism, alienating its industrial worker base, particularly as deindustrialization also hit France, although not as severely as it hit the English-speaking world. That working class based and stay loyal to the lesser evil, and they also didn't have a mass organizing base to oppose it either, and a lot of them eventually migrated to either the ultra-left or the National Front, which is now the National Rally. So the German SPD was an independent socialist party. They didn't need a clean break because they were coming up in a time where partly they were even illegal, which also makes it funny when we talk about the inability to form independent social parties because of minor state laws, when you're talking about parties that rose to power in the 19th century that were outright illegal when they were formed. The early SPD had a clean break with the Democrats because they were afraid of the same liquidation that they saw in the People's Party, and they also wanted no truck with bourgeois parties, which was a standard line in the early Second International. I know people forget that. The CPUSD was part of a popular front, but there was a de facto dirty break by the liberals. Many of their gains were co-opted as gains by the New Deal, particularly in the Great Society, particularly in civil rights. They liquidated their own independence, which created an ability for them to be easily destroyed by McCarthyism, and you see this in their numbers, which declined radically in the 1950s. The French socialists came in with an electoral coalition, kind of a Front Populaire, but their main base was public sector workers, technocrats, and intellectia. You know, what we might call the PMS, are the strata that used to be petite bourgeois, but because of their own structural limits in capital, they implemented austerity, and then had to manage a neoliberalization for basically 2 generations. The modern DSA comes out of the realignment strategy of Harrington, which I do believe we can safely say was abandoned between 2012 and 2016. And the two things that have become popular for it today is the party surrogate line, not a line I support. The dirty break, I support a little more, but I think it's going to be really hard to see when that happens. Or a clean break, which almost nobody likes. Who mainly supports it? You have urban progressive enclaves. It does have significant working class support, even of the blue collar variety, and of, you know, a lot of people who are, we might call, in precarious employment, but also a professional managerial strata, which is being proletarianized, but not a lot of pull into non-urban areas, not a lot of pull into red states, with some exceptions. And they often function, whether they mean to or not, as an activist wing for urban Democrats and a way to inject vitality in a party that doesn't really have it. And that party is not the DSA, which is also structurally not legally a party anyway, in so much that parties are a thing. So I'd like to thank the 2 original commenters, and you can see the first episode for the comments, for your insights. You both pierced through a tactical fog to look at a fundamental structural and class contradictions that have paralyzed American socialist left for decades. The DSA's problem is not just one of ideology. It is also one, as I have written in my book with Daniel Tutt, The People Are Not One, of a response to the economic fragmentation of the working class through atomization, lumpinization, the vindication of Robert Putnam, the breaking down and commodification of civic institutions and of civil society, and a few other key problems that, like franchisization, neoliberalization, breaking up large monopolies, the organic composition of capital, aka automation, meaning that factories don't need nearly as much physical labor to do things. I think we're going to see that with AI and automation, even if you do see some pushback on AI as a technology, and even if it's never really profitable. So I want to talk about two more things before I fully close this out, and probably give us a few more things to consider. So let's look at the Chile example with Unidad Popular, or Popular Unity, Allende's group from 1970 to 1973, famous for Cyberzen and the Cardones programs. And I have a lot of good things to say about the Chilean social experiment. But the Chilean experience under Salvador Allende and the Popular Unity Coalition provides the most tragic and precise warning about what happens when you intend to use existing bourgeois state architecture to retrieve socialism, while actively managing or dampening autonomous working class power to avoid provoking the right. And that's particularly sad because the use of social technology and community structures in the Cardones system, as well as use of cybernetic principles for the possibility of making the Cardones system even more manageable and thus reducing the need for things like apparatchiks, really was a possibility opened up by Allende that you really didn't see anywhere else except for maybe the collective period in the People's Republic of China. Allende was elected on a plurality vote, not a majority vote, in 1970 on a platform of structural transition to socialism within the existing constitution of Chile. He believed that Chile's long democratic tradition would allow the state apparatus to be utilized for the working class and for the laboring classes, including the peasantry. Now, I've done some episodes on this. You can go back and look them up. They're mostly in the first 2 years, and particularly with Boric's management of Chile and how that did not go well. But I also covered the Cardones system and Cybersen and the misunderstandings about that. So it's more than just like democratic socialism and, but in response to immediate capitalist sabotage, lockout, a CIA-backed trucker strike that the AFL-CIO helped with, designed to starve the cities, the Chilean working class didn't wait for the state. They seized factories, they organized their own food distribution networks, and they formed with the Unidad Popular, the Cardones Industriales. The industrial belts, which were autonomous, horizontally organized organs of workplace democracy and popular power that were actually pretty efficient at maintaining things like provisional leadership and getting production done on time and well. Rather than leaning into the Cardones system as the embryonic basis for a new independent worker state, are even leaning on their Cybersen developments that they were working on with Stafford Beer. Allende's government, particularly pressured by legalistic moderate factions within their own coalition, frequently sought to restrain workers, and they definitely refused to arm them. They feared that illegal factory occupations would alienate the middle class, violate their own constitutional norms, and trigger a military action. The state tried to incorporate these factories into official bureaucratized state-managed sectors instead, and they were aiming to use Cybersen to reduce the bureaucracy and help the Cardones system survive. So they weren't intending to keep the bureaucracy going on forever, from what I understand in reading several books on the subject, including a couple in Spanish. But by prioritizing constitutional legitimacy and trying to placate the bourgeois institutions, particularly the parliament and the military, which they did not organize along a Cardones system or apply Cybersen to, over the expansion of using their independent cordone system and arming it, the Unidad Popular left the working class completely disarmed. And when the right was not placated by Allende's legalism, in fact, they used the time to coordinate the brutal September 11th, 1973 coup, as well as use Allende's armed military against him. The lessons for 2026 are absolute. You cannot use the rules of the bourgeois state to dismantle the bourgeois state within its own legal limits. And holding back autonomous organizing to avoid productive reaction only ensures that when reaction arrives, the working class is all but defenseless. So what does this mean for responding to this? So to address the original questions that we talked about in episode 1 directly, we have to look past the immediate tactical maneuvers of 2026 and examine the historical implications of left-wing organized development. When we look at the Socialist Party of America, the Communist Party USA, the German SPD, the French Socialist Party, the Chilean Popular Unity Coalition, and I should mention one more in my notes before I get to this. And Italy's Maximalismo from 1919 to 1921, you see a problem. So let's talk about Maximalismo again, which is maximalism. This is what produced Mussolini. Anyway, modern debates often assume that if an organization just adopts a more radical rhetorical platform, it solves the problem of opportunism. In the history of the Italian Socialist Party, the PSI, during the Biennio Rosso, I don't speak Italian, but it's close to Spanish. So if I pronounce it like Spanish, I'm sorry. The 2 red years prove the exact opposite. Radical rhetoric without structural class struggle and the acknowledgement of those struggles in your structure leads to paralysis. Following World War I and the Russian Revolution, the PSI was dominated by the maximalist faction that was led by Giacinto Minotti Serrati. The maximalist won control of the party in a platform that explicitly rejected reformism, hence the name maximalism, formed the dictatorship of the proletariat, and even wanted to join the Communist International. Electorally, they were widely successful, becoming part of the Italian Parliament in 1919. But despite their revolutionary rhetoric, the maximalists were fundamentally an electoral and parliamentary formation. When the working class actually moved in 1920, occupying factories in Turin and Milan, setting up their own Red Guards, and bringing Italy to the brink of revolution, the PSI's maximalist leadership froze. They have built an incredible voting machine, but they have no strategy for coordinating an actual seizure of power or defying state. And they treated the factory occupations as trade unions disputes rather than a political insurrection. During the Livorno split, frustrated by total paralysis, the disciplined revolutionary left wing under Amadeo Bordiga, friend of the show, not really, and Antonio Gramsci, frenemy of the show, not really, made a clean break with the maximalists and the PSI at the Livorno Congress of 1921, which created the Italian Communist Party, the first Italian Communist Party. It's reconstituted from its clandestine period in the late 1920s through 1940s when it was illegal. But because the split had happened after the peak of the workers' class offensive and it had already passed, the left was fractured at a very bad moment. Furthermore, the maximalist rhetoric did not just lean itself to maximalism on the left. No, it produced the rhetoric of the Italian fascist movement, and Mussolini himself had been associated with the maximalist faction of the Italian Socialist Party before he created fascism. The institutional impasse of the PSI, combined with the subsequent fragmentation of the left and the inability of the PCI, the Italian communists, to really seize on the power of that moment because of their divisions on how to handle the rise of fascism. It terrified capitalists and landowners who were terrified by the rhetoric of the revolution, but without any actual revolutionary program, they lacked the structural power to execute it. And they turned to Benito Mussolini's black shirts, who used the very rhetoric the maximalists had pioneered themselves. And within the first half of the 1920s, they had dismantled the entire socialist infrastructure, and no real coherent popular front had formed to fight them. Nor is it clear that they would have been successful even if they did. So an organization can pass the most radical resolutions in the world at its convention, but if its day-to-day existence is tethered solely to winning legislative seats rather than directing material struggles on the shop floor and in the street, it will likely freeze when the real structural crisis hits that is beyond the electoral function of the government's control. Now, I am not using this to say that we should not engage in electoralism. That's not my point. It's just you have to remember what electoralism is for. If you cannot cleanly seize power, I follow the classical Marx and Engels dictum that you should only strategically obstruct bourgeois government, never sit in a government you don't control fully. And while you're not going to necessarily oppose things that will ameliorate the conditions of the working class, you aren't also going to make it your job to defend them if they're not in a government you could control and implement those policies in your way. Now going back up to my key points. Sorry about the slight lack of structure. I skipped one of the sections of my notes. So if you look at all these 6 examples, in addition to the DSA now, the path forward becomes a little clearer, maybe not totally clear, admittedly. And it demands a radical departure from the core organizational common sense, while admitting that there are issues with reading into just radical rhetoric, small sectarian formations, and stuff like that. You still have to be mass. So the first commenter is entirely correct about the psychological blocker to the dirty break. When the DSA members argue that they will break from the Democrats only when there is no threat from the reactionary right and the need for their populist coalition is no longer necessary, they are surrendering to what is likely a permanent hostage situation. The Democratic Party requires the threat of the reactionary right to justify its own existence at this point. Its original coalition of groups that were part of the transition to the bourgeois world, but were not necessarily fully integrated by it, of the Southern planters, various small business functions, the petty bourgeois, the yeoman classes and subsistence farmers, sharecroppers. This was not an obvious coalition to represent the working people, even if you looked at where the working people were siding in the Democratic Republicans versus the Federalists, you would be confused on if either one of them were particularly liked. Today, the Democratic Party represents finance capital, publicly traded capital, as opposed to private equity and privately traded capital. And it used to represent tech interests, but as we've seen, the tech interests have switched sides pretty dramatically in the last 4 years. So because of the incoherence of that coalition, and because of the need to appeal to other disenfranchised elements of American society, racial, gender, etc., these marginalized areas are very real. Don't get me wrong. that they can't produce anything but maybe representational benefits for. So I'm not saying the Democratic Party won't help these people on margin, but it is on margin, and a lot of what they can do easily is like name an army base that was formerly named after a dumbass Confederate general after like the first non-binary lesbian in the military in the Civil War, are, you know, really encourage development of Black political leaders while not really doing that much for Black poverty. The only way they can really justify their rule then is through fear of their opponent. And it is a symbiotic loop of lesser evilism that is mutually constitutive. The right does it too. And when they want to pull back everyone they lose when they're in power, they use the threat of the Democrats to do it. If you condition your independence on the absence of a right-wing threat, you've locked yourself into a permanent loop. And as commenter 2 sharply notes, and go back to the first episode to hear the comment, they're both long, so I didn't feel like we're reading them. The idea that the Democrats can be reformed from within is laughable without more money than even all of the current mainstream unions have, and even a few billionaires who back them up have, because their donor base doesn't really want it, and their voter base is afraid of the right more than they are willing to impart positive benefits. By acting as an uncritical left insurance party policy for a bourgeois party, an organization absorbs all the blame for the system's failures and can be a scapegoat for the same people while the ruling class reaps the benefits. We saw this exact dynamic play out in the CPUSA's popular front strategy in the late 30s and 1940s, where they mothballed their independence to defend the New Deal coalition against reaction. Got immense pressure for pressure from that reaction, but got immense popular support for doing so, but also put their leaders at a strategic disadvantage and subordinated to Democratic Party functions when there was a turn against them in the late 1940s, which left them completely vulnerable when Eisenhower came to power, and the turn against them was more complete. See the Smith Act, see Taft-Hartley, etc., etc., etc. So the Democratic Party establishment absorbed their wins, but then liquidated the communist movement during the Cold War without batting an eye. So is the alternative a clean break? Yes, but only if we redefine what substantial preparation actually means. If a clean break simply means swapping out a Democratic ballot line for an independent third party line while maintaining the exact same electoral first methodology, or insisting on total ideological unity before the work with the general public is done, it is a recipe for immediate marginalization, both because of the U.S.'s duopoly's draconian ballot access laws that vary from a state-by-state level, but also immediate preparation does not mean just raising more money on knocking on more doors for independent candidates. It means recognizing that the ballot box is an away game played on bourgeois territory. You might have to play it, right? But it's never going to be fair. Authentic preparation means building independent working class institutions, plural, from which a party, singular, can emerge and coordinate, allowing for vertical and horizontal alignment. Independent tenant unions, aggressive rank and file labor caucuses, labor staffers who are more from the rank and file themselves, self-funded media that is funded largely by membership dues, educational infrastructure, both independent from people like me, and also from institutions that are aligned with the party. These can wield material power outside the state to build up the power within the state. That's the only inside-outside strategy I give a shit about. We cannot replicate dual power from 1917 the way Lenin did it, because we are not living in a quasi-bourgeois state that is in major crisis and in wartime. I mean, we're always in wartime, but not the way that the Russian Empire was. But we do need that kind of independence and to be able to prove that we don't need all these state institutions to use our own power, because those state institutions are not fully in our control. You can see Zoran Mamdani's difficulties with his budget, which he's now balanced through accounting tricks. I've read the budget thing. It is largely changing amortization payments and stuff like that that balanced it out. The thing is, you can't do a lot of these more than once. If New York has a couple more rough years, they won't work. Then you're going to be looking at the possibility of austerity again, which has happened in much larger situations in the past. And I can't think of a progressive mayor who hasn't run into it. I'm actually going to give Mamdani credit for playing this better than anyone I've seen in the second half of the 20th century. All right, so don't think I'm coming down on Mamdani for this, but the structural realities are still there. 2. The first comment is observation about Minneapolis that Paul hits on a hidden material driver of modern socialist strategy. Its class composition, its need for free labor, and its electoral geography. Why does the modern left stay anchored to deep blue urban cores and to student bases? Because it is electorally cheap and it yields immediate dopamine hits, as well as immediate electeds, but not necessarily any policy coming out of those electeds. Those areas are heavily populated by people who are in the labor aristocracy and what we might call the professional managerial strata, or what we could also call the former new bourgeoisie. I am influenced by the work of Nicholas Poulantzas, and if you read my book with Daniel Tutt, you'll see that. NGO workers, academics, tech workers, cultural industry professionals, and even credentialed blue-collar workers are highly receptive to progressive, moralistic, and redistributive rhetoric, and also are in need of redistributive policies because they frankly do benefit from them. The problem is that winning an election in such a progressive district requires very little class struggle. It does require some, and it is going to require you like keeping a lot of the more marginalized and disenfranchised in urban areas on board. So it's not nothing. I'm not saying it's nothing. I know people are going to misread this, and that's not what I'm saying. Right. And I'm also not saying you need to purge the PMS from your ranks. You frankly can't. You need those skills to reskill parts of labor. You also need the PMS, though, to learn from labor, to learn from blue collar labor and other things that they don't know, particularly as they're being, frankly, marginalized by technology at a rapid rate. It requires a savvy ground game and a mass platform that captures an existing Democratic Party electorate. But these victories are completely detached from an organized militant working class base beyond those areas. So you're not just talking about international solidarity, you're not even achieving national solidarity. The elected officials have no disciplined collective to hold them accountable, and the DSA and everyone and most of these organizations cannot deal in the kinds of money that the electeds need to protect them from groups like AIPAC or the DNC itself, or. Furthermore, a lot of these NGO groups need massive amounts of donations themselves to keep up, and often have people on their boards who are funneling money into them and can get captured pretty easily. So they're also not a way out. They inevitably get swallowed up by the legislative logic of the state, whose rules they don't control and whose republicanism was designed to specifically to stop the majority from seizing the minority. But the minority they cared about wasn't black people or women or immigrants. It was the rich. Explicitly, go back and read your Federalist Papers. And the NGO apparatus, which is dependent on, again, massive donations. There are very few NGOs. The DSA is one of the only ones I can think of that runs on membership dues. Now, we have seen this film before. In the pre-World War I German SPD, a party built a massive electoral machine that generated a brand new social stratum, thousands of full-time party bureaucrats. This stratum gradually prioritized the preservation of the party infrastructure and its legal status over its program. And when crises arrived, they had no way to deal with it and capitulated. Similarly, we see this with Mitterrand, who won a massive electoral victory in 1981 on a radical socialist reform, but because the party was an electoral vehicle dominated by technocrats and professionals, rather than the organized working class capable of defending the economy against capital strikes, Mitterrand had to capitulate to authority to keep any part of his program intact. Now, the French have way more than we do, and hell, I'd take a Mitterrand fuck up over what we have right now, but nonetheless, post-Marxism is not just the creation of a bunch of postmodern academics. The postmodern academics are a creation of socialist failure. We live in a society. If the left is to have a future, it must make a conscious strategic pivot away from its current trajectory. But it does need to do so wisely and without just trying to run another dumb fucking third party that can't really do anything. If you need to run an electoral road, and I think we do actually, it is to obstruct and it is to build a socialist program to establish something like a line that is receptive to the working class needs and doesn't let short-term liberal answers be the better answer to those needs. Because at the end of the day, as DSA, who I often disagreed with, was arguing about me, the liberals didn't win for nothing. It wasn't just ideology fooling them. That's not how ideology works. So do I support a clean break? Yes, under very specific circumstances. And on that note, we'll end it here. I will put my works cited in the show notes for some of the things that I mentioned today. You can find more behind the paywall. This ends this two-part episode on breaks dirty and clean, and hopefully you learned something for it. I strongly suggest, guys, I don't do these works cited for nothing. I think you should probably read the books if you have time, or at least listen to interviews by the authors. Some of them I've done, but you can find them anywhere. You know, like, yeah, I'm not going to interview Gramsci or the Ehrenreichs, but, you know, because only John's still alive, as far as I know. I know Barbara Ehrenreich's dead. I did a discussion with Gable Rhea on her death. All right. And on that note, protect your peace, like and subscribe, hit the bell. There's more behind the Patreon wall, and you can get access to all the audio for as little as $4. There's, Jesus, thousands of hours. There's something like more than 1,000 episodes. There's my entire archives of even the stuff I did before I did VarnVlog. You'll find it all there. I've been doing this since 2012. Since the year the world was supposed to end. So, protect your peace. Keep fighting for a better tomorrow. And don't forget, just because people disagree with you or disagree with me on some of this stuff, they're still your comrades. There does have to be lines on comrades, but disagreements of electoralism is not the most profound one. But we don't want to get captured again. Take care.